Welcome to our podcast, A Novel Talk, co-hosted by Carl Lee, and I'm Wendy Kendall, cozy mystery author. I have a sweet treat of a summer beach read for you, my new mystery romance, Cherry Shakes in the Park, an adventure of dangers, divas, and frothy delights, now available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online retailers. My romantic suspense, Snow-Kissed Cookies to Die For, is available at all online retailers. Desiree is a first grade teacher and Leo's on the school's maintenance staff, and they're falling in love. But Desiree's being stalked. There are several suspects, including Leo. Is he Desiree's the one or the stalker? And the Snow-Kissed Cookie recipe is included. Or triple your mystery fun with my anthology, Sprinkle with Sugar, now available at online retailers. Enjoy my mystery book that began it all, Cat Out of the Bag. That's Cat with a K for Catherine Watson. She's a purse designer and amateur sleuth who goes from designer bags to body bags when she's faced with a murder mystery. In the prequel, Purse-dachio Makes a Splash, Catherine and Mayor Brenda Durling investigate a chilling cold case. The exciting sequel is in the works. Just wait until you see what Catherine's facing this time. Thank you to all the readers who've let me know how much you enjoy my books. And here comes your co-host.
Thanks, Wendy. My name's Carl Lee, and I write paranormal fantasy. I do not have the litany that Wendy has yet. But I did get an email from Amazon saying that she has a new book available, even though I had already pre-ordered it. Wendy?
Well, here's our guest introduction. Our guest today is Michael January, a writer for film and television, as well as a travel writer, photographer, private pilot, and novelist. He is a California native and has lived on the U.S. East Coast and in London. His travels have taken him across Europe. His noteworthy Favorite Castles book series is up to 5 volumes. His films have shown on HBO and Showtime, and he's in the screenwriting documentary Tales from the Script. 50 Hollywood screenwriters tell their stories. His 2 historic novels are such excellent stories, too. The Secret Memoirs of Mary Shelley, Frankenstein Diaries, The Romantics. That was his first historical novel. Next is a World War II adventure and love story of pilots in the Battle of Britain, titled Aces. Welcome to A Novel Talk, Michael January.
Hi, Wendy and Carl. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Quite an introduction. And I was listening to your intro about Snow-Kissed Cookies to Die For, and the included recipe. Makes me think maybe I should include the recipe for creating life in my Mary Shelley book. But maybe that's for the sequel.
Yes.
I think that's an excellent idea. I'll mix some up.
Actually, there is a recipe. Mary, she actually did sort of tell us what that was in later time.
I'll have to look that up. But speaking of Mary Shelley, I loved Secret Memoirs. I thought your use of language created a cool antiquity to the story. It was like it was written by Mary Shelley's hand itself. How did you replicate that flow?
Well, that was the idea of the book, and a portion of it is actually Mary Shelley's own writing.
Well, that would make it easier.
So what I did, so that's why I list her as a co-author, and she's got part of the copyright. About maybe a quarter of it is Mary's actual words, if I had to count. And that was really the inspiration for writing it. Mary's first published work was not Frankenstein, But in 1817, she published A History of a 6 Weeks Tour, which was a diary of her elopement trip with Percy Shelley and Claire Clairmont, where they traveled to Paris, mostly because Percy was interested in that Napoleon had just been defeated. And they were chased there by Mary's stepmother, Mary's hated stepmother, who was mostly trying to save Claire from the scandal of them going off together. Then after Paris, they decided to go to Switzerland and had to walk across France, following the track where the Russian Cossacks had chased Napoleon's defeated army back to Paris, ravishing the countryside. In her published volume, Mary described where they went and what they saw. And it was a wonderful description and a personal picture of, real life at the time. But she wrote nothing about the personal lives of 2 teenage girls and the poet of free love on a tour across Europe. Mary was 16. Her stepsister Claire was, I think, just about to turn 16, so she was 15. And I was just in Europe, and I saw hundreds of young people on their European tour. But, in her published book, she didn't say anything about their arrangements or what happened or what was going on. And I thought, well, that's kind of missing. If you're gonna read about, try to understand who Mary and these people were, you kind of have to get into their heads.
Yep.
So the language and tone I took from Mary's own writing and then merged my voice with hers for the novel, because I wanted Mary telling her own story, and I hope I achieved that.
You certainly did. It was a beautiful. If you mixed 2 different authors' writing, you merged it seamlessly, I can tell you. Speaking of Mary, her and her stepsister Jane, or Claire, their upbringing was in the same house, but it created 2 very different people. What aspects of their past made Mary so reserved when contrasted to the more flamboyant Claire?
Yeah, well, Carl, that's I guess what really fascinated me about it. If I was going to figure out what was happening between these 2 sisters, stepsisters actually, what were their personalities? In truth, there really wouldn't be a Frankenstein without Claire or Jane. And it was an emotionally complex household. From Mary's writing, she was clearly deeply contemplative and an intellectual thinker. And despite her becoming involved with a married man at the age of 16, and actually entertaining the idea of Shelley's inviting his wife to live together with him in Switzerland, she was a bit of a prude. And this influence was probably taken from her father, William Godwin. Claire, or Jane's mother, Mary Jane Clairmont, was an entirely different figure. We're not really certain what her true name was. She had claimed marriage to a man who was probably not really her husband or Jane's father. She was in debtor's prison under a different name before she married Godwin. But if young people take their identities from their parents, Mary Godwin was defined by her mother having died in childbirth, bringing her into the world. And Mary had this deep guilt she felt that she had killed her mother. But she idolized her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, as the author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women. But because her father had published a salacious biography of Mary Wollstonecraft, she had been canceled by literary society, we'd call it today. And Claire, or Jane, didn't really know who her father was with her mother's changing stories. So where Mary has a very defined view of the world, Jane, at least for me, had a freer view, trying to make her own definition of life. And the book is partly Mary's search for a connection with the mother she never knew, through her writings about the French Revolution and other travels, which is part of her reason for going on this journey. And okay, maybe I should explain for your listeners the complicated name issue here, which can be quite confusing. We know Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley from her Frankenstein book, which didn't actually have her name on it until a later edition after she was married. She didn't marry Percy Shelley until the end of 1817. So during this time of my book and the writing of Frankenstein, she was Mary Godwin. And Claire's real birth name was Jane Claremont. And she was known as Jane until about this time, when she just decided it was a plain name and too much like her mother, Mary Jane Claremont. And she started calling herself Claire out of the blue when she was learning French. But she spelled it Claire when she was feeling French, and spelled it Clare and sometimes Clara, Clara, when she was being English. It was so confusing, even at the time, that Mary in her letters called her Jane in one part of a letter, and Claire and or Clara later in the same letter. And I found this is what I found so fascinating as a clue to their relationship. Mary's exasperation at her stepsister so loose a grasp on our identity that I have a moment when they are introduced at a society dinner where Jane is thrilled to be accepted into upper crust society where she's sort of longed to be. But when she's introduced, and where the aristocracy are used to multiple titles, her name is announced with all the variations. Jane, Claire, Clara, Claremont Godwin. A little bit of embarrassmant, but it's also the key moment for Mary, because she's mistaken for her mother by the Swiss aristocracy, Mary Wollstonecraft. And Mary at that moment realizes, even though her mother was forgotten at that time in England, she was revered for her feminist ideas out in the world. And it was a vindication she'd been looking for. So she gets very, very emotional about that. It's sort of the discovery she's been looking for.
Yeah, it was an excellent scene too in the book. I love that.
Well, also my favorite scene in the book is Claire's drinking. They keep serving her wine, and she thinks she's supposed to keep drinking. They keep filling the glass because they're servants. And she thinks she's supposed to empty the glass. So she gets drunk on wine and wants to go dancing and falls in a cake, which is I think one of the funniest parts in the book.
That is a great part of the book, I'm going to tell you. The details of their trip from London to Lucerne provide the reader with easy imagery to be in the moment with the characters. Have you traveled that path? I know you've traveled a lot.
That was kind of my inspiration for the book. I have followed that path. I didn't know it until later. There's a road through France, the N85, which was basically the road then, and it's a road now. And I was traveling from Switzerland back to Paris, so I kind of went.
You went the wrong direction.
on the opposite way. But later on, when I read the travels, I said, "Oh, I've been to all those places. It all sounds so familiar. A lot of them are still there." And I've since been to some other places that I use in the book that she's less clear about. And weird, I was just on this trip. I was in Geneva, and I was there with a guide, and we walked some of the streets that Mary would have walked when she was living there. And there's still portions of, except for the signs, they're pretty much still the same.
No, that's awesome. That's one of the great things about travel, is being places that other famous events have taken place. It's just, I love that aspect. During their journeys from France to Switzerland, they hire a man to drive a mule attached to their cart. The man brings to mind Mary's greatest character, Frankenstein's monster. Was that fact or fantasy, that man and his countenance?
Well, I'm glad you asked. That sort of defines for me where my mix of fact and not fantasy, but trying to find the deeper meaning of things kind of meet. In her writing, Mary describes this man who drives their mule cart in great detail, and he becomes for a time their antagonist, just a guy driving the mule cart. And she describes how they're all having to stay together in the same lodging on one dark night, and a startling encounter between that happens between them, Why is this such an important detail for her? It's a frightening scare for a teen girl in that moment of perceived danger. But after being frightened, she recognizes they're really just sort of two people thrust together, and it makes her think about the nature of humanity. She doesn't, of course, say it made her think of a Frankenstein monster, because that came later. But my theory as a writer, and why I considered this trip the real origin of her Frankenstein novel, is that the well-known and oft-told story of her waking from a dream in Switzerland and writing a whole novel is not how writing works.
Not for me.
Not for anybody. Writing comes from a total of our experiences that when we sit down to write, they sort of come together in a recipe. And this moment on an 1814 summer trip, would be so indelible for her that it would come back 2 years later when she was thinking about a science student's experiments and what an ungainly, nearly 8-foot tall, frightening creature like this coach driver, might be like. So it came to me that I can't prove it, but I think there's an inspiration there. And also at this point, I have to admit, is my fictional representation of a relationship between Jane, Mary, and Shelley. For the ending of the book, I go off a little bit in my own world because there was a section that she didn't write about, which was also kind of my key for doing this. She never said, nobody really knows why the book is called Frankenstein. She sets her characters in Geneva, which is a French-speaking Switzerland. So why would they be called Frankenstein, a German name? We here think of the movie and all speaking German, but the book is mostly, she goes to school in Switzerland, but she comes from French-speaking Geneva is where Victor Frankenstein is from. There's been suggestions that it was the Frankenstein Castle in Darmstadt, where she got the name on this trip. But she does not say anything about it in her journals. And it seems to me that she skips a part of the time, like she took part of the journal and just sort of tore it out because she didn't want to talk about it. So I go there and I come up with, and I sort of take my imaginary trip of what that journey, part of the journey was about. And so there's a moment where Jane is frustrated, where Jane, the stepsister, Claire, is frustrated in her inability to seduce Percy Shelley, because she's been trying to do that all along. And she deeply wants to feel that she's a desirable woman that her stepsister is. And Mary's already pregnant at this point with her first child. And Jane strips naked to seduce Shelley and bend him on a stone at the Darmstadt Frankenstein Castle. But they're interrupted by Mary and some traveling students, and it's one of those embarrassing moments of youth. But what Mary sees is the scene she later describes as the dream image when she's creating the book of the creative man Victor Frankenstein bent over this sexual monster that he has created in Claire. Shelley representing that figure. To me, it's my view of the nature of the Frankenstein book. That at the core of things is, the book has a lot of intellectual discussion and all the things that Shelley's ideas and the things that Mary read and thoughts on philosophy, but at the core, it's about the relationship of love and creation, and I think that kind of comes from partly from this trip and Mary's growing intellectual curiosity and growing up surrounded by philosophers that form the recipe for the book she writes. And she never really replicates it with her other writing.
Yeah, that's I remember the scene at the castle too. That's pretty awesome.
Well, it's a bit of fun. I try to make this, an enjoyable thing. It's, whereas
Success.
the Frankenstein novel is sort of like, a little deep to get through. But I wanted to have enough character entertaining lightness in my view of these people
Yeah.
in real life.
I have to order a new copy. I no longer have a copy, and I would like to reread that after reading your book. As a screenwriter and travel author, have you ever been somewhere that a story that simply pours out from the area or the setting? You didn't go to this place specifically to write a story, but all of a sudden this story just comes out?
Well, that's pretty much what I do a lot of. I'll visit somewhere and something about a place will suggest a story, or it will inform a story that's already rolling around in my head. And I like to have a specific place that I know or have known or discovered to write a story. I sort of, I come from a visual world, a film world, so I kind of have to describe what I see in my head. So if I have a clear picture, I'm not that good at inventing worlds, so I like to have a real place to tell a story. And I also think sort of people come from the environment that they live in and the rules of that world. So that's what I like to do.
Yeah.
I just love there's just so much research behind these historical novels of yours. It makes the reading just delightful. And in your exciting book titled Aces, your two pilot protagonists have very different pilot styles that in some ways reflect each of their unique lifestyle personalities. Can you speak about these memorable protagonists?
Well, yeah, that was kind of the intent. When I started to write about a girl in love with two different men who have this drive and a skill and love for flying, how could I define the difference between the two of them and the ultimate cost of her choice of one over the other? So when you fly at that level, you become one with the machine. So I wanted their flying style to be defined by their personalities and kind of vice versa. Mickey, the German, is cool and controlled, and he's all precision and correctness. And he also needs to compartmentalize what's happening with the politics in his country and his duty. Like he says, I don't control my government, I fly my plane. And this also defines his relationship with Lacey. And even though he clearly deeply loves her, he's unable to express it in a humanly connective way. While Aaron, in contrast, is all freestyle. He's emotion and the moment and improvisation, and he flies like he feels and is uncontrolled in his personal life as he is free in the air. And this is why Lacey allows herself to be influenced by her conservative, wealthy parents, because, the wildness of Aaron's soul, which is why she's in love with him, but it also scares her because it's so out of her control.
And sometimes out of his control, it seems. It really makes the reading.
That's the purpose of being wild and free is, you sort of go off in whatever direction you feel like. And he does that in his romantic life too, and that costs him.
Yes, yeah. And as a reader, wow, just to follow that is very interesting. And then what happens with the German protagonist too is unpredictable. But the personality contrast is really great reading. And then beautiful Lacey, the third in this provocative and unpredictable love triangle in your book. These three are thrust into life-altering times in the early part of World War II and with the Battle of Britain. Can you talk a little about both the romantic and the wartime challenges that shape these three young adults?
Well, that was kind of the concept of the story. You start out with a young love triangle, which is suddenly changed by world events. Stuff happens, and the choices you make, become something entirely different when fate steps in. Lacey is convinced by her parents to marry a German count because they're sympathetic to what Hitler is doing with the industry in Nazi Germany, sort of, American firsters of the time, like Lindbergh. And since her father is looking to sell lots of steel to Mickey's father's factories. But little do they know that the romantic fantasy of being married on the Hindenburg airship, before it blows up later, will turn into bombing those same factories. And Lacey finds herself living in the midst of Nazi Germany, surrounded by such brutal injustice that she feels compelled to risk her life, forming a forged document ring to help Jews escape. And she goes from a naive, privileged, rich American housefrau to becoming a spy, dodging the Gestapo. I have to say that this is not all so distant, like the current, situation with Putin, until war makes the dictator's colors sort of show up and history repeats itself.
Yeah, I have to say that did surface in my mind as I read this a few times, and this transformation that Lacey goes through is really compelling. You're just cheering for all of her efforts. So much of your story too is also about friendship and about misunderstandings between friends and about absent friends. There's so many dimensions and layers to friendship in the course of your book. And quoting Walter Winchell, a real friend is one who walks in when the rest of the world walks out. I love that quote. Can you talk a little about the theme of friendship in your book, Aces?
Well, aside from being a love triangle, it is a story about friendship and the turns of betrayal and forgiveness that can drive deep friendships. It's said in war that you're really fighting for the buddy next to you in the trench. So how does friendship survive the forces that separate us like war? And it's not just a friendship between Aaron and Mickey, where they're separated by the distance and the war and a romantic rivalry. But also the friendship of their college friends, Donovan and Wilson, who give up their privileged lives to follow Aaron to war with the RAF, and trying to reach beyond themselves, maybe where they don't belong. And it culminates in this point where Donovan, flying in the air, sees a plane flying next to him, and he sees the symbol of the javelin painted on its nose and realizes it's Mickey, who went to the Olympics as a javelin thrower, which is now his identity as a pilot. And Donovan freaks out because he's just as likely to shoot him down, but instead Mickey, now a feared German ace, is just waving hello to an old friend. But when Wilson is the other friend, Wilson is shot down and dies with Mickey holding his burned body in his arms and mistakenly believes that it's Mickey who killed his friend. Their friendship turns to hatred, and they're now enemies sworn to kill, which sort of drives, the rest of the book.
Yeah, there's so much emotion in all that, and beyond those three primary characters, this group of friends, you really, as a reader, you get to know and love all of them for their distinct personalities. It's really an incredible read that way. You're excellent at carving out these characters.
That's my job.
Well, the other thing that was so impressive, your action flight scenes and the dog fights and the combat. They are so exciting to read, and they include technical details, but they're cleverly woven into all the intensity of the action. And then the emotion is just gripping. Reading the scenes, I actually felt like I was up in the cockpit with them, with the exhilaration and the danger. What is important as an author in writing these scenes, and how does your own experience as a pilot contribute?
Well, that's probably where part of that came from. I'm proud of the aerial combat description, and again, my job as an author. If I'm going to take a reader somewhere and my job is to put their butt in the seat and make them feel like it's real. Otherwise, why read the book? And I come to this from film writing, where my job is to create a roller coaster ride experienced visually on a screen. And so I'm trying to create that same thing in a novel with words on a page. And if I'm talking about war, we should feel that too, like we're in the middle of it and don't know if we'll be the lucky one to survive.
Yes.
I have flown, certainly not at this level. I wanted to be an Air Force fighter pilot as a kid, but found out you had to have 20/20 vision. I did some aerobatics, with some time in a World War II trainer.
Oh my gosh.
But nothing like this. But if I'm going to write a book about flying, I want to take the reader flying with me. And if I have a viewpoint of how to make that real and how to make war real, that's what I try to do. I get the best review comments about that part of the book. Sometimes I get the occasional comment about too much detail, like I'm trying to show off.
Oh, that didn't come across to me at all. Boy, you really took me for a ride on it. And at the same time, I felt like I just sort of absorbed some of that informational part, but it just kind of absorbed because, yeah, my butt was in the seat. That's for sure.
Well, that's the effect I'm trying to go for. So I'm glad that worked for you.
There's so much about the whole World War II era that just fascinates. What was the particular appeal of setting this story with these characters with the Battle of Britain?
Well, I've always been kind of fascinated by World War II and World War I for that matter. And my travels in Britain and through Germany, I did 3 movies in Germany, so I've spent a lot of time there and kind of got a sense of what that place is like.
Yeah.
So that's why I have Lacey living there in Germany during the war, because I've been to some places there that still remain.
Mm-hmm.
On a trip to Essen, which is in the Ruhr Valley, which is where Mickey's father's factories are, and where Lacey lives for a while. I was driving around. I was over for a movie shoot and had a lot of time, so I went to go and sort of explore. And I was driving down the highway and found the modern Krupp factory, where they now make refrigerators and coffee pots and elevators. But in 1939, they made Panzer tank parts and artillery shells. The Krupp factory, the Krupps were known for making these great cannons and things. But they're now still a modern company. And you drive around the modern factory to the back streets, and you can still see the old bombed out brick buildings left from the war, hidden away behind a wall, like they're trying to forget.
Yeah.
Wow. And if you visit cities like Dresden or Munich, I lived in Munich for a couple of times. When I learned German at the Goethe Institute, and I was doing a rewrite on a film script. But you walk around the city, and you notice, there's a modern building and then an old building, and a modern building, and whole sections are sort of just gone. And you realize, the damage that was done with the massive bombing, and sort of get the real sense of what the cost of blindly following charismatic leader bent on self-aggrandizement and believing the lies until there's no escape, and you sort of have to pay the retribution. And you get a sense of what life was like, so I thought I wanted to explore that in the story.
If only we can read these stories and learn from it and not repeat history. But wow, Aces is an amazing read. It's very gripping.
Well, Wendy, your book sounds almost as interesting as the one I got to read.
Yes. Yes, almost.
And Michael, speaking of reading, would you mind reading something for our listeners?
Okay, I'll read a section. This is not really a flying section. This is kind of their personal relationship section. This is kind of early in the story when uh, Lacey is deciding her pressure. She's had an argument with Aaron, and her parents have pressured her to think about marrying the German. And so this is kind of a moment at that point. So Aaron raced his Buick along the Pennington Road at top speed. He pushed the pedal to the floor, burning out his frustration with the air and gasoline mixture being pulled into the 8 cylinders. He enjoyed the wind in his hair. It wasn't flying, but close, as the trees whipped past in a blur of green and bright specks of sunlight. The car floated with a lurch as it lifted over the rises and then bottomed again on the grade. On the floor by his feet, 3 empty beer bottles rolled in a clinking clank from one side to the other with each bend. As the car raced past Murphy's soda shop, Aaron's blurry vision could make out 2 familiar forms visible at the table by the window. He stabbed the brake pedal. His foot missed it the first time, but then found it. The Roadster's brakes smoked as the car skidded to a near stop and snapped in a spinning turn in the middle of the pavement. Mickey and Lacey looked up from their conversation at the sound of squealing rubber. They looked out on the road to see Aaron's Buick roaring back and careening into the parking area, skidding to a stop in the gravel. One of the beer bottles tumbled out of the door as Aaron pushed it open with his foot and stepped out of the driver's seat. Mickey stood up from the table as Aaron pushed in the door. Mickey was ready for a fight, but Aaron just grinned that big, sloppy little boy smile he could muster as if nothing was wrong. "Hi, I was just passing by and thought I'd stop for a cool one." Lacey was calm. "It looks like you've had a couple already. We're kind of in the middle of something, Aaron." "So I could see. Mind if I join?" Lacey thought about the other customers, some families with children. She wanted to be honest with him. "Come outside for a minute." She started for the door, but Aaron didn't move. "We're not a team anymore?" Aaron just stood staring at them. Lacey pushed past him and went outside, swinging open the screen door with a creak of the spring hinges. Aaron still held Mickey's eyes in intense glare that was half question and half challenge. Finally, he shoved out the squeaking door to where Lacey waited on the walk by the window, nervously playing her finger on her arm. "Is there something you want to tell me that's not fit for the kids?" "Cuss me out?" he asked with an edge of sarcasm meant to blunt the coming blow. "Come on, Lace, here I am. Go ahead and tell me what an arrogant, unfocused, ne'er-do-well slum rat I am." Aaron, she wanted not to tell him at all, but it was a big, bright road sign that couldn't be gotten around. "Mickey has asked me to marry him." Aaron stood frozen to the spot. He looked through the window to Mickey, still inside, standing by the table, looking out at him with no revealing expression. Suddenly, Aaron turned and started for the door to go inside. Lacey grabbed him. "Aaron, don't!" He stopped again and spun back. His legs were wobbly, but his mind focusing from the cobwebs for a crystal moment. "So what did you say?" "I haven't said anything yet. I'm as surprised as you are." He tried to calculate permutations of the future in his mind, choices to be made, decisions, but they were just a bit foggy. "Is that what you want? You want to get married?" "I want someone to love me for who I am, all that I am." She said it as honestly and forthright as she could manage. She had never been the sort of girl who imagined princes and bouquets. Her visions had been more of being something in the world when it came to it. She wanted to be loved. "Well, if getting married means all that to you, I'll marry you." He blurted it, really meaning it, but as if the idea had just appeared from nowhere. "Wow, Aaron, that's the most romantic proposal I've heard in a long time." "What, in the last hour? Jesus, this has got to be the most romantic spot in the world." He gestured around the porch walk with its dime candy machine and mechanical rocking horse with rusting paint. Aaron, please don't get upset. Don't make a scene. I'm going to tell him I'll think about it. She hated finding herself in this moment. She loved Aaron. She believed he cared about her, but he could be maddening sometimes, and everything else. Aaron stared at her another second, taking in her features as if studying a map. The blue eyes with flecks of iridescent green, the nose bridge just a little too wide, the little scar that cut a tiny gap in the golden strands of her left eyebrow. The imperfection of perfection, he thought. Then he threw open the squeaking door, going inside. The screen door slammed with a bang behind him as Aaron stepped just inside the door, looking across at Mickey, challenging, ready to fight, but feeling the eyes of the mothers and children all staring at him. Finally, he turned again without a word and stormed out. Lacey came back inside to Mickey. She didn't know what to say. She didn't really know what she felt at that moment. She didn't want to hurt either of them. Maybe she didn't have to decide at all. She could put it off and go on to school. Mickey didn't say anything either as they both watched together out the window as Aaron jumped back into his roadster and fishtailed out of the lot. Aaron drove like a madman to the airstrip at Lawrenceville. His Buick tore across the grass runway, cutting in front of a Stearman biplane, accelerating to take off. The Stearman pulled up hard into the air, just missing the car, almost stalling as the pilot shook his fist at the wild driver. Aaron skidded to a stop in front of one of the corrugated metal hangar sheds. He pushed open the door of the Buick and almost fell out to the ground. He caught himself and leaned against the door to drain the last of the beer from a bottle, tossing it into the back seat with the empties, clinking with them like a gathered row of soldiers ready for inspection. Staggering to the hangar, he slid back the door, revealing his racing Ryan inside. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but knew he needed to make a point, and he was sure that whatever it was would come to him.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. Thank you. That was an excellent reading.
Very intense. Thank you so much, Michael January, for joining us for a novel talk. Can you tell us what's next for you and your fans?
Well, my next historical novel, which I'm about to pre-launch, is The Boy King's Tale, as told by Geoffrey Chaucer. It's based in true history, medieval love story, and rousing adventure mixed with intrigue in the earliest days of young King Edward III. He'd come to age when his mother and her lover overthrew and murdered his father, told by Chaucer as one of his tales. Someone said it's like Game of Thrones, but with Joffrey as a good guy.
Ah, yes.
And it's really the true history where that author based his Fire and Ice books on. And I have a new manuscript for a cozy detective murder mystery, paranormal mystery, set in an English village. I've just been asked for a read from a publisher based on a contest entry, but I'm writing under a pen name for that series and will be a little coy about it since I'm writing it as a woman. Like I did Mary Shelley. So I think my ego says I can pull it off. And I've just been traveling in Europe again, where I'm researching a story I've had in my head for a while, a sort of allegorical murder investigation with Mark Twain as the detective,
Oh, wow.
delving into the assassination of the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known in movies and TV as the Empress Sissy, who was stabbed while she was boarding a boat in Geneva. Like my Mary Shelley book, my intent is to use some of Twain's unpublished writing about the event woven into a fictional interpretation of the author when he was at one of the lowest points in his life, questioning his own fame and misfortune and the attraction of murderer stalking a celebrity, sort of brought his mind to the problem. But that's a ways off.
Well, it sounds like there's lots for us to be looking forward to. And listeners, you will want to check out the website michaeljanuaryauthor.com for more information about the author and his works. And you can follow him on Facebook at Michael January Author. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And remember, a novel read leads to a novel talk.